Hey, everybody. Hope you're all having a fantastic Tuesday, depending on where you live, late afternoon or early evening. We're having the stream a little bit at a different time today. Instead of 8 p.m. Eastern, we're going live right now at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. But we're going to be having an amazing chat with a wonderful gentleman who we met at Freedom Fest. I'm going to introduce him in just a moment, but I really appreciate all of you for understanding our little kind of mid-summer break that we took from the streams. We had our team at Freedom Fest 2023 in Memphis, Tennessee. It's been our third Freedom Fest so far, and we've been very much welcomed by the broader Liberty movement and the Freedom Fest team themselves. A lot of atheists that were at that event, and we were able to grow our movement quite well. So I really appreciate a lot of you for kind of understanding the difference in our streaming schedule. But typically we go live here on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And if you're watching from YouTube, for example, please be sure to hit the notification bell so you're notified whenever we go live on future streams, videos, and podcasts. So really appreciate it. And thank you all for continuing to be loyal viewers of our streaming series here. So our member of the week is Gregory Coricello, guys. Be like Gregory today and become a member at atheistsforliberty.org. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that stands for free speech, free thinking, and freedom for all. We have an amazing team throughout the United States and memberships, mostly people in this country, but also around the world. And we're doing what we can to make this country a better place and to show that our fight for Enlightenment values doesn't stop Monday through Friday. So we're going to go ahead and introduce our guest right now. So my team at Freedom Fest, the comms team, they were very busy trying to find and acquire even more talent to have here on this series. And we found an amazing individual, a comedian, author, and podcaster, a man with a history in the current culture wars, Aron Flam. Thank you so much for coming on.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I know we were chatting a little bit backstage for 2 minutes or so about how I really appreciate the flexibility. You're not from the US, you're from, all the way in Sweden. So I know there's a big time zone difference there. So whenever we can get people with different perspectives and people with those time zone differences, it's really awesome for you to be here. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Thomas, and I hope you can hear me properly.
I can.
You're a technical idiot when you can't even get a Blue Yeti to work, so I'm working with the internal mic of the computer at the moment.
Oh, you and me both. That's why we're using StreamYard.
All right, okay.
No dissing to StreamYard. I'm just making a joke, everybody. So let's get into our first topic here. So I know you are not the biggest fan of socialism. Obviously, we met at Freedom Fest. The team met you at Freedom Fest, and Freedom Fest is a big haven for libertarians, classical liberals, people that kind of have a right of center view, especially on economic matters. Atheists for Liberty, we don't really take a view so much on fiscal issues. However, what's very interesting, because we pay attention to the culture wars every day, is there's been a very strong correlation in growth from both in terms of socialism being accepted more and more throughout the West, and this kind of new kind of woke, anti-free speech, anti-comedy, social justice movement. And I know it's not so easy with you being in Sweden, in that sometimes some of the biggest advocates for socialism use Sweden as kind of this example of successful socialism. Denmark, yes. Sweden, and Norway, like Bernie Sanders kind of likes to say. From your perspective, I guess, as a comedian and as someone who's kind of operated in the public stage, as someone who talks about these cultural issues, how dangerous has this kind of rise of socialism be in the correlation with the rise of this kind of woke, anti-free speech, social justice movement?
Well, it's funny because I noticed the culture wars through comedy, so to speak. Mm-hmm. When I went into comedy many years ago, I sort of had as a principle for myself that I wouldn't be doing the difference between men and women jokes, because it seemed such a trite and tired area. But what I noticed through the years, as I went along in my stand-up comedy career, was that suddenly I was in a climate where women could do as many sexist jokes about men as they wanted, but men could no longer do sexist jokes about women. That was faux pas. So that sort of caught my attention. And as a comedian, I've always been interested in what I call cultural specific taboos.
Mhm.
So because there are biological taboos for humans, like don't have sex with your siblings or don't eat feces, because those are universal. I mean, you can argue for the benefits of both based on our biology alone.
Sure.
But when it comes to cultural specific taboos, I think they're more interesting and rife as subject matters for comedy because they say something about the culture you live in. Now, Sweden is, of course, probably the oldest social democracy in the world. So we've been around longer, and since we've been, as we say, a neutral country, we have avoided the disruption of wars for a very, very long time.
Yeah, you guys have stayed out of world affairs for the last over 300 years, over 300 years on the most part.
It depends on who you ask, but between 250 or 300 or so. And we actually we're applying to join NATO at the moment, which I personally always have been for, but as with all things in Sweden, there has been no public discussion about it. The Social Democratic Party, who has ruled for the better part of 100 years and built the entire welfare state here in Sweden, they went into the last. Now we have a right-wing government at the moment, but basically, even though we have a lot of parties in Sweden, they're all just basically different flavors of social democracy. That's how big and if in opinion polls at the moment, the Social Democratic Party in a parliament of 7 parties, I think, has 40%. Mm-hmm. So it's enormous influence, not only on Swedish politics, but Swedish industry and culture, and has been for a long time. So the last social democratic government we had, they were like bone hard, as they have always been, that we should not join NATO. And then Russia attacked Ukraine in February of 2022, as I'm sure you know. And they made a very silent pivot. The same type of silent pivot they made in 2015, when they had been pro-open borders across the political board, more or less, except for one party. And within a week, without any public discussion, we did a 180 and closed the borders because Sweden couldn't take it anymore. And since 2015, I think we've gone from like 8 million to 10 million people. So Bernie can stop mentioning us, because it's all coming down like the Potemkin village. It has always been. So that was my way into the culture wars, because as cultural specific taboos, when you look at Sweden, we've had long-standing social engineering programs, as we call them, to create the new socialist man or woman or a gender neutral being. It has evolved over time, so to speak. And I noticed that almost all our societal problems, as a comedian, as a critic, had to do with these social engineering programs. And I noticed that most of them had already crashed several times. And then the government will investigate what has gone wrong, and the recipe is always more of the same policy. The problem is we didn't apply enough of this policy. So you can look at gender ideology. Sweden was definitely first to apply it. And even though you have Shulamit Firestone as a early theoretician from the United States in gender ideology, we have our own women of equal standing that has affected culture. The difference between the United States and Sweden is that we get shit done. when the Social Democratic Party and the left in Sweden decides to do something, they simply do it, and the entire population traditionally has just marched in one direction. So we're a country extremely susceptible to groupthink, which is also a great subject matter for comedy. And the more comedy I made about these matters, the more censored I got. I originally had some type of Daily Show, Jon Stewart-like show on Swedish state television, because our biggest broadcasters in both TV and radio is the state, of course, which we pay for forcibly through tax. And no, there was no vote on that either. That was just decided for us. So I worked there as show host, producer, scriptwriter, and I noticed fairly immediately that all my jokes that were aimed against the right just flew past the censors, while all my jokes written against the left were bogged down by opinion. And if I persisted, then real censorship, some bureaucrat would come in and say, why? It's not like the US, where you have private owned media in the same, and a sponsor might have a problem with what you say and therefore pull the money. Here, I mean, their funding is guaranteed.
Right.
So
they'll just pull you off.
This is just political bias, basically. So that was my way into the culture wars, one might say. And since then, I've been cancelled so many times, it's frankly ridiculous by now.
Well, glad to have you join our ranks, because we've experienced the same stuff over here stateside. I guess when talking about Sweden, comparing Sweden and to America, this goes into the second question here. We've had a few international guests on this program before, and I always like to ask this question. It's shocking when I get very, very harsh answers, even amongst other English-speaking countries. But in one thing that's so great about the United States is our First Amendment. It allows us to say virtually nearly anything we want to say. We are able to get away with saying some of the most offensive things, but also some of the most correct things in the name of safeguarding our separation between religion and government, our freedoms of speech and expression. So many wonderful things that we have here that other countries, even other countries that proclaim to have a culture and love of free speech and open debate and open dialogue and civilization. Oh, we're civilized here. They have nothing compared to us. From your perspective, obviously you visited the United States several times. Compare Sweden and the United States. What benefits do you think that the United States has that Sweden just simply doesn't have? And maybe what are a few things that Sweden has that maybe the US doesn't have when it comes to this ability for the individual to be sovereign enough to fight back against this madness?
Well, there it is. You said it. Individuality, which comes from your constitution, which comes from the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. And as a comedian growing up, even in Sweden, stand-up comedy comes from the United States of America. It's a uniquely American form of art, I might be so pretentious as to call it art. I mean, you're basically telling jokes to people who like to drink on a weekday. For me, it's an art form, at least. And, it was a struggle for you guys, too, even though you have the First Amendment. Lenny Bruce went through trials to be able to say dirty words. And, I mean, George Carlin's is famous world over for his 7 little words,
Yes.
The classical routine of comedy. But Sweden is a bit different. I mean, Sweden is very proud of its freedom of the printing press that we were apparently one of the first countries in the world to have. But you have to remember that this was at the time a monarchy, still is a monarchy, but in name only. It's a social democratic monarchy. So it's a illogical mix of two things that really don't mix. But he doesn't. He's a figurehead, our king. He doesn't really have any power. You understand? Yes.
Yeah.
So it was a monarchy. So mainly the freedom of the printing press was a way for the king to keep track of people who had printing presses. It was a list, basically. And then freedom of expression, you might say, we really got for real first in 1993 or 1994 when we joined the European Union.
No freedom of expression before the late 90s?
We had a freedom of expression, but you have to understand the difference between the United States freedom of expression and the European, you could say almost a pan-European variety of the same, which is the difference between positive and negative rights. So for you, it's a negative right. The government cannot stop you from saying whatever you want. You are born with vocal cords, and by virtue of them, even though you're dumb, you have hands, you can do sign language, you can do something, and they are not allowed to stop you. That's your starting point. Our starting point is the opposite. We have positive rights. So the government has given you this area of free speech, and your rights are not something you're born with in Sweden. It's more, in principle, if you're to go by the social democratic creed, something given to you and guaranteed by the government. And since those two starting points are so different, that affects culture immensely.
What's so interesting about that is that we're already, well, I would say 10 years ago, we started to kind of see the university system in this country adopt this idea of positive rights when it comes to free speech. This idea of free speech zones started to become very, very, very popular on the American campus, where
sure, I thought you have safe spaces.
There's safe spaces, and then that, which basically prevents you from saying things that trigger too many people. And then there's these free speech zones where, oh, okay, you can chat about anything you want over here, but it's going to be in this tiny little circle where we're not going to have much student traffic nearby. So if you say anything controversial, we don't get too affected much, but we still get to look super intellectual and super patriotic to get everybody's money still. So it's always good, I feel like, to look to Europe for inspiration, but sometimes I think we face the consequences of that a little too much.
I think so too, and I think a lot of what I see, because I follow news from all over the Western world primarily. Mm-hmm. Let's face the facts. I'm a cultural chauvinist, and I admit to it.
Or could you say that a lot of people from Sweden? I've noticed that whenever I've met people from Sweden, they're very cultured, and they go to like nearly every country in the civilized world, and somehow they have more knowledge about things than most people. That's just my take on Swedish people.
Well, you must have met very intellectual Swedes then. Mostly, I just encounter scoundrels and charlatans. But because socialism does destroy a culture over time, it's unavoidable. But there was actually there's a statistician. Is that how you say it? Statistician.
I believe so.
Someone who does statistics. From New Zealand. He has a blog. David Rosado is his name. And he actually did like a model where he tracked woke terms like, misogyny, racism, Islamophobia, all over the globe, in news media, all over the globe. And 3 countries are actually way ahead of you guys. We started at least 5 years earlier. In Sweden, I would probably say much, much earlier. What you call woke, we call consensus culture. Everyone has to agree because of collectivism. The difference between, why you are individualists to a higher degree, or used to be at least, than we are. And Sweden, Canada, and Australia are apparently way ahead of the curve when it comes to woke terminology in newspapers. But it had started years earlier in academia, right. In the humanities, where because I studied partly I studied business economics, but I also have a degree in film studies, which I gained mostly in Sweden, but also a year abroad as a FES, as you call them, a foreign exchange student in Canada. So I have actually been, and this was, I think, 2002, 2003, which is when this, the floodgates had opened and they had taken over, and most courses were about, internalized misogyny or the patriarchy or structural racism and so on and so forth. So yeah, there are what I was getting at is when I follow the news in the Anglo-Saxon world, especially Britain and the United States, I think the reason you see, and Australia for that matter, and Canada with Jordan Peterson, the reason why you see the culture wars there so clearly is because you have individuals and you have a tradition of speaking truth to power, and therefore you don't just submit and assimilate, whilst here, it's been going on for years. There hasn't been much protest. When I did a very tame comedy special, which loosely translates to groin, where I dealt with primarily gender ideology, which I had studied at university, it was quite controversial, even though it was, in my eyes, and in retrospect, way too tame.
Way too tame in comparison to how it is now?
Yeah, I would say they've upped the ante some since then. We were saying that, my original joke, because I was taught at university that there is no sex, basically. We don't separate that, it's just a social construct. And my joke was, well, anyone who believes that has never been kicked in their social construct, because that really, really hurts. And since then, I mean, now we have people without a social contract, with a social construct within between their legs, apparently,
right.
Whatever, gender fluidity and non-binary.
Everyone's like a Barbie and Ken doll now down there.
Yeah, apparently. And now that film is the highest grossing by a female director, no less.
Yes. Yeah, yes. How amazing. Although I know that there's actually disagreements in anti-woke circles about that film. We could probably get to that another time. But actually, so speaking of all this terminology, especially utilizing it as a comedian, obviously the terms safe space, trigger warning, social justice, these kind of terms have been used so much now in the culture wars, especially by critics of these people. Or I would say about the past 10 years, nearly the past 10 years, when this stuff started to kind of get popular on the internet and in culture and even in the United States. Are you finding that some of the material now are continuously talking about it from a comedic perspective is becoming slightly dry? Are people kind of too used to hearing jokes now about safe spaces, about social justice warriors? Do you think we're kind of entering kind of a new cultural shift to where now these people are in power in all of our institutions across so many countries that now it's like just complaining about it or making jokes about it is kind of dull and we have to come up with new material?
That might be true. Also, I think there is a real shift, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, where people actually protest against these policies and ideas. When your Supreme Court just a few weeks ago got rid of affirmative action and allow the culture to refocus on meritocracy, I would say that's a step in the right direction. Right. And I hear that a lot of Fortune 500 companies are now reducing their DEI workforces. So one might say that you're undergoing something. Yeah, what one can see victory on the horizon for you guys.
Maybe we had reached like rock bottom, and now because we're so down in the dirt, now there's no choice but for us to go up.
Oh, trust me, you are so far from rock bottom. Come stay in Sweden for a year. So yeah, our girls in school perform very well, and our boys perform extremely poorly. And that, I think, has to do with policy and the way they have rearranged education to benefit the female sex. and after a while, you can see the curve for the girl goes up, and the curve for the boys goes down when it comes to average, what do you call it, grading. But after long enough, both curves go down.
Do you think that that's all, obviously I don't, speaking of another woke joke, I don't think you're a biologist. I know that was a big thing, a year ago. But I know that usually there are studies that show that just boys, especially when they're growing up, are just inherently, they don't like to comply with certain boxes and codes, while women are a little more, especially during that early development stage, are usually able to learn and obtain information through that system in a much better way.
Women are more mature. I have Pinker here. It's on my desk, actually. With some other traits, the differences are small on average, but can be large at the extremes. That happens for two reasons. When two bell curves partly overlap, they have different normal distributions.
Right.
The sexes. On average, there's not much difference between men and women. But at the extremes, the difference is huge. And if you have a lot of choice, for instance, I mean, here in Sweden, you can observe a phenomenon we have termed the gender paradox. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
But essentially, I mean, you can do you can do how much policy you want in schools. Try to get girls more interested in math, boys more interested in nursing. But when they get out into real life, if they are free to choose,
they adapt right back to their traditional gender roles.
Precisely. So you see domination of men in construction work, and you see more women in caring professions.
Right. I've heard the same claim that in times of scarcity, the same thing happens. In times of crisis and emergency, you have women that go back to the naturally more feminine roles, and males go back to the entirely more masculine roles. And I think that's true. We have Jesse Cruz here in the comments saying that's biology, man. And I think that's very true. And I think that's a form of science that I think more skeptics and advocates of free thought need to kind of embrace. We don't always have to. Obviously, we should question everything, but simultaneously, there are parts of science that naturally might look politically more conservative or politically more traditional. Well, but if we really are advocates of science, we should just embrace that and be okay with that.
Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's inherently good. I mean, murder is natural in all human societies. We don't see it as a moral good just because it's natural.
Right.
I'm just saying that if we deny nature, then whatever policy solution you come up with will fail. Right. So I mean, because originally I don't really care. I'm very secure in what I am. I don't doubt myself anymore. I'm 45, so I mean, I'm not a teenager. I don't need to experiment. I've done that. It's over, yeah. So
gotcha. And now we will end the show. No, but I really appreciate you commenting on that, because I think one of the biggest ways I think that people have been able to make public stances against this kind of politically correct madness is through comedy. I actually got my start in politics and actually atheism through Bill Maher, who's kind of a anti-woke comedian but also a staunch atheist. Are you one of the people that are kind of joined in his ranks? Are you an atheist yourself?
Well, when I was young, I used to be a militant atheist, I think, or at least in principle, which means I didn't exactly deny God, since you can't prove him or disprove him either way, but you don't have to actually obey. I mean, I was born Jewish, but I eat bacon and I mix milk and meat, and I don't attend temple very regularly. It's mostly weddings and bar mitzvahs, I suppose, which is a family thing more. But the older I get, the more I understand that if you are to be an atheist, might do you well to hold on to the concept of truth, which I think is a monotheistic idea.
Mhm.
And when you get rid of monotheism without a better ethical system, which I think is possible through rational thought and debate, then you'd better have that ethical system, because otherwise it's the same as with the sexes. Humanity reverts to the mean, which is relativism, polytheism, neo-heathenism, not hedonism, which would be much more fun, even though they're usually one and they usually go hand in hand for most heathens. So yeah, and that's, I think, what I partly see in Sweden.
Gotcha. Yeah, I maybe I'll take you up on the offer to come to Sweden sometime. I would like to see it. I wouldn't like to see the policies being enacted. So I'll admire everything there, but then I'll also take keep my phone on me to pay attention to my flight. I bet
the
it's
city center still looks lovely of Stockholm.
I would love to go to Stockholm. It is actually one of the cities I would actually like to visit in Europe. I was in Austria a year ago, talking actually about an issue I know that's plaguing Sweden, Islamism, which I know is a whole other topic I bet that we could get into as well.
Absolutely.
I bet Sweden's having a grand old time with it.
Yeah, well, we were probably one of the first countries in the world to open the door for Islamism to enter the West. And that's part of what I wrote in the book that the Swedish government or state spent years prosecuting me for. Yeah, we can get into that. And Sweden is at the moment actually the center. I mean, the Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran, has said that Sweden has declared war on the Muslim world at the moment, and there are Shia and Sunni militias everywhere apparently hating on Sweden, and we are now supposed to be, and I quote an Islamist group, Swedes are now Israeli Jews, which means that, killable on sight, I suppose. And it's because we've had a series of Quran burnings. First, a Danish/Swedish citizen who doesn't like Muslims very much made a sport out of going from suburb to suburb, usually Muslim-dominated neighborhoods, and lighting fire to the Quran. And then lately we've had probably maybe former Muslim immigrant or Christian Arab, possibly employed secretly by Iran and or some other entity, who has burned the Quran on a few holy days outside of different embassies. And since Swedish freedom of speech tries to prosecute comedians for making fun of socialism's allyship with Islamism, they do allow us to apparently burn Qurans outside of the Turkish embassy, for instance, if that can get us out of applying for a NATO membership, at least.
Isn't it interesting how the moment these woke activists, or the moment these people, they reach their own rock bottom, all of a sudden then, once their own self-interests get, are needed to be achieved, all of a sudden they're fine with understanding that inviting people who hate democracy, who hate diversity, who want to bring forth theocracy into your country is concerned, that finally they start giving a damn.
Yes, well, the argument mainly from not only the left here, but also people on the right and Christian Democrats and so on, is now, it's all over our media, it's that we can't hurt these people's feelings. It's hurtful to their feelings, and therefore we should limit our already pretty limited freedom of speech. But these are people who beat women to death for dressing how they want, or just dressing how they want, but not as they want exactly, which sparked the Iranian uprising here a year ago, as you might remember. They hang homosexuals from cranes. They execute homosexuals and atheists in some of these countries. It's illegal to be an atheist. And, they, how do you say it? They claim that they want to annihilate Israel, which is, they say they want to commit genocide. And in some cases, Islamists have committed genocide, if you look at the Yazidi community and so on. These are not people whose feelings you need respect.
Right.
These are not people you want as friends.
Do you think that
you don't even want them as distant relatives?
Do you think with all this happening, eventually the people of Sweden will reach an overall breaking point where the vast majority starts to stand up against this, just for the sake of saving their own civilization at that point?
I thought so many years ago, but I don't have that much hope for the Swedes anymore, as our current debate clearly illustrates. There are people standing up for our freedom of speech and saying the things that I just told you about large parts of the Muslim world. No, I don't think so. The Danes woke up after their cartoon mishap. But I don't see it happening en masse in Sweden. The socialist bloc is just too strong, and their affinity with the Muslim world, which is rarely reciprocated, is just too ingrained.
Ridiculous. Well, I'm very sorry to hear of that. I know that's not a warm thing to say, but in that case, I know everybody has their own view of immigration, but I always appreciate it too when people who admire this country admire the values, the Enlightenment values that allow us all to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom from religion. Come on over here. Usually, those are the type of people I think that we should accept in this country with open arms. And it motivates me more as president of Atheists for Liberty to continue our fight for Enlightenment values in this country and to push back against theocracy, because we don't want to see it here. We've seen Islamist attacks actually in the United States recently over the last few years. Salman Rushdie, nearly a year ago, around 11 months ago, he was attacked in upstate New York. I live in New York State. And that's happening there. It's not even one of the most populated Muslim areas in the United States, and yet it's starting to occur here in the bastion of free speech, in the bastion, in the country with the First Amendment. So it's something we really need to do more. And that's why I really encourage more people to become activists with our own organization, to give support as well. If you're living abroad, to give support to your own friends and family members who are suffering through this kind of madness, and to encourage more people to just join in the fight if they can, especially since not everybody has that luxury.
Well said. I agree. Salman Rushdie lost a hand and an eye, apparently.
Yes.
In the knife attack. And in a way, you can say that the Iranian fatwa has won. Because, apparently you can't hide, regardless of how long you live. You can see, a part of the left's excuses or the mainstream media's excuses for Islamism, you can sort of sense the fear beneath, the polite arguments, but the fear is definitely there.
Yeah, not all will admit it. Well, everybody, we're still doing what we can to keep our fight up, and it's very important for all of you to stay up to speed with what we're doing as an organization. We post a lot of these updates on Instagram. So if you have an Instagram account, go to Instagram.com if you're on a browser, at Atheists for Liberty. That's our Instagram handle. And if you're on the app, just search up Atheists for Liberty. We should be the top option there. And please, guys, go ahead and give us a follow. We're also very active here on this YouTube channel and coming out with a lot more content if you're watching us here on YouTube. So be sure to like this video, guys. It takes 1 second just to hit that video. It helps us with the algorithm. And hit the notification bell and subscribe to see more content coming out. We want to really grow this series, bring on more good voices. But with what Aron Flam was just saying here, that could be the United States very soon. We take our First Amendment for granted, but we shouldn't sit comfortably knowing that there are people that would want to do everything they can to destroy this nation and the very values that make us being atheists for liberty possible. So become a member at atheistsforliberty.org today, guys. Go to atheistsforliberty.org, sign up for a membership, and be sure to just stay up to speed with what we're doing on social media. If you have any kind of social media account, we are likely there, and please go ahead and give us a follow. Let's go ahead by answering some of the questions and comments that we got here. We got a few of them coming on in. So I'll go ahead and just state one here. We got Mars stating that Blank Slate was a great book. It poses a lot of questions that need to carefully be answered by ethical and responsible people. Progressives shoot themselves in the foot through cancellations. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a good comment, but it's not really a question.
I always have the policy by showcasing comments if we don't have enough questions. So I always like to mix the questions and the comments together. Oh yeah, Mars meant progressives. Not a problem. Took care of that. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think he's correct about the book?
Well, yes. I wrote a book a few years ago about what social democracy has done to this country. Because the first social democratic prime minister of Sweden was Per Albin Hansson, one of our welfare state's founding fathers, sort of a Mount Rushmore type figure. And he was elected in 1932. Now, Hitler rose to power in 1933, and the build-up of the Swedish welfare state went hand in hand with the build-up of Nazi Germany. And this has to do with Sweden's special brand of social democracy, which I think it has been successful in spreading all over the world. Because socialists, unlike libertarians or conservatives, are actually quite good at working together across borders, which is to our detriment and their success. The Swedish social democracy, one of the oldest in the world, their house philosopher is from the early 1900s, Axel Hägerström. He was a nihilist, a value nihilist, as they say, which makes the socialists of this country mostly pragmatist. It's hard to discuss things like principles or metaphysics with people who look at the world in materialist terms alone. And Sweden has always been Germany's biggest, Germany has always been Sweden's biggest export market, 20%. Still 20% has been for over 100 years. So it's not so strange, but I think most Swedes, my book that I wrote, it's called This is a Swedish Tiger. It's the original tiger looked like this. Can you see it?
Yes.
This is a Swedish tiger. And this is my parody. And as you can see, it is not exactly the same as the original. Regardless.
YouTube, that's for educational purposes. That right
Yes.
there, what you just saw on the screen, that's for educational purposes, guys. This is
It certainly
an
is.
educational organization and an educational YouTube channel.
Don't worry, I have won 2 court cases, actually 3 court cases about this already. So it's and it's a joke, really, because the animal tiger is not natural to our fauna. The elk would be more logical, but the word tiger in Swedish has a double entendre. It can mean both the animal tiger and the imperative word, or just a verb to be silent.
Right.
It was really a message to the Swedish populace from their government during the war to keep silent about the cooperation with Nazi Germany. There's another old Swedish joke, which is Sweden was neutral during the war. Until 1943, we were neutral on Hitler's side, and after 1943, we were neutral on the Allied side, right. Which is kind of a fun joke in Sweden, but also not true. As I show in my book, Sweden went on with their dealings with Nazi Germany until late 1944, when the war was pretty much all but over.
The Allies circling in, taking every bastion of Axis territory they could at that point.
Exactly. And I think, had you asked most people in Sweden from 1933 up until 1944-45, they would have said that, of course, they were on Germany's side, and maybe they liked Nazism, maybe they didn't like Nazism, but Germany, I mean, that was our second language. If a Swede in those days spoke a second language, it was probably German. And after 1945, we did 180 degree, and everyone learned English. So, I mean, it's quite fascinating how fast things can move in hockey, as you say in my country. I wrote about what the Swedes did during the Second World War. I wrote about what they did from 1974 and onwards, when Olof Palme, our great and last of our founding fathers on the Swedish Mount Rushmore, when he connected with Yasser Arafat and actually became the first Western prime minister in their official capacity to welcome Arafat, and he met him just before an important speech Arafat held at the UN, which pivoted the Palestinian cause from an Arab-Israeli issue to a Palestinian-Israeli issue, which was funded in part also by the Soviet Union, who wanted to rebrand the entire conflict to better align with the uprisings they were funding in Africa against colonial powers. Mm-hmm. What happened was that police kicked down the door of my publisher and confiscated 1.5 tons of these books. And then I was prosecuted for 2.5 years almost for apparently copyright infringement. But as you can see, because copyright infringement is usually about a piracy, right? Something that is so close to the original that you can't tell the difference. Mm-hmm. So they said they prosecuted me for the jacket of the book, but the prosecutor, time and time again during his arguments, came back to the content of the book, and his argument was, how can this jacket be a parody if the contents are serious?
Right.
Which, of course, is sort of the definition of satire.
So obviously, I want to do what I can to make sure that, for all the Americans and all the people around the world that are watching, I have the link to your website in the description of this stream. Where could people obtain copies of that book if they want
Amazon Kindle is probably the easiest way. Okay. You can buy them on my webpage. I am restructuring it in July. It will be up again in August, aronflam.com. But so in Sweden, we've never had a law protecting comedy. We've only had a judicial praxis. You understand? And that praxis was called the so-called parody exception. It wasn't the parody exception. It was the so-called parody exception, which meant that whenever it went up against the law, you could censor a comedian.
Right.
And since I won, we now have both the so-called parody exception praxis, and we have the EU protection for copyright, which actually gives us a very strong protection for comedy. To reconnect with your question about free speech earlier. So now we have a strong protection for comedy, but it's still, I don't know, shaky and being frozen out of American society. I mean, I'm betting in America you can find a place where you're free if you want to, if you really want to. Maybe not the place you want, but there are free spaces. And in Sweden, if you're frozen out, traditionally you're frozen out of society completely, and it's for most, at least ethnical Swedes, a fate very hard to bear.
I bet.
I don't have sufficient respect for my fellow countrymen actually to care that much anymore. So yeah.
Well, maybe if we can do what we can to still help, and if anybody's interested in reading your book, guys, go to the website, but also look up his book on Amazon, and let's see if we can get you some extra sales there. Because if your own
that
country,
would be nice, because I wrote it in part as a warning to the rest of the West. What happens when you let in leftism? Because the first part of the book is 3 parts. The first part is about the Islamist washing that has been going on. Both in Sweden and internationally, which we were pioneers in, actually, I'm proud to say. And being sarcastic, I'm just explaining sarcasm because
That's why I said in the
American.
beginning, I said thank you for opening the floodgates.
Yeah, and the third part is about what Sweden did during the Second World War. But both these parts are tied together by the middle part, which is about what social democratic, so-called social democracy, which is a form of corporatism, which I'm sure you're starting to feel the effects of. Which is, when unions and big corp and government, collude to sort of, what would you say?
Attack the individual.
Yes, precisely. So, the second part is about social democratic ideology and its effects. And I think that would be useful to you as Americans and defenders of freedom to read. I mean, if you're not interested in the Swedish historical parts, so be it. I understand.
I'm a history buff, so I'll definitely get a copy. But for everybody else, I think just to show support to other defenders of freedom and secularism in other parts of the world right now where they don't have the same amount of rights and liberties that we have here at home, I think it's very vital for us to do so, especially if we want to prevent more and more of that chaos from coming over here. That's one of the reasons I'm part of an international coalition of people called the Clarity Coalition with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and a few others. And we want to make sure that Islamism stops spreading throughout the West. And I have a very Americanized perspective on all of it because I don't want it to enter our own borders as much as it's entered other countries. I want people to see what's happening in Sweden, happening in Germany, happening in the UK, even happening in Canada, as just a warning for more Americans to wake up to this stuff. And so when I hear stories like yourself, fighting back against this stuff and having to deal with the isolation from your own countrymen for standing up for what is right, it makes me sympathetic.
That's part, I think, of what socialism does to people is that they make them very bad at recognizing true fascism when it appears, because they call everyone fascist and racist and Nazi. I was during the prosecution, they said that I was probably a member of the Nordic Resistance Movement, which is a white supremacy group, and I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors on both my maternal and paternal side. So
yeah, you'd be a very odd member if you were to join them.
Especially if you read my book, which my victory, the judges actually felt compelled to write that my book is against anti-Semitism and Nazism, just so it was in the verdict. Right. But culturally, it doesn't matter to the left. They will continue to call you a fascist or a Nazi or a racist. Either way, they don't care. But it makes you very bad at recognizing true fascism, which is, for instance, what Iran is. Mm-hmm. It's an Islamo-fascist theocracy. Right. Yeah, it's and if they want to complain about the patriarchy, there's a patriarchy for you.
We'll continue on a little bit more, probably for the next 15, 20 minutes max with questions. I want to be sensitive to your time, but more and more of them are racking up. So people are really enjoying this discussion. So everybody, I really appreciate it. Again, subscribe to the channel, like the video, hit the notification bell, guys, because if you like this content, we're going to continue coming out with more of it, and we would love you guys to be loyal viewers. So we got Jesse making a comment here. I'll just quickly address this myself. He says, you can say Islam if you want. You don't have to say Islamism, LOL. We had Sam Westrup as one of our previous guests here on the show. Yes, there is a distinction between Islam and Islamism, which is more political, social political Islam, especially injecting into the West. I do know of the distinction, but definitely as an atheist who thinks that religion is a bunch of dogma and a bunch of nonsense, I am not a fan of Islam either, but definitely Islamism is very much a threat to civilization, Sweden and the United States, both.
Well, Jesse has a point. I mean, Islamism doesn't come from, I mean, it's in the word.
Yeah.
The clue is there.
It's Islamic. It is
Yes.
Islamic.
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to be one of these people that is politically correct and backs away from that. That was one of the big problems in the atheist community for so many years. We were one of the first cultural movements to kind of embrace this kind of sensitivity towards Islam. And I'm not going to back away.
Which is very strange indeed, is it not?
The free thinkers, the skeptic community, right, were some of the first people to get this sense of Islamophobia. How dare you say
Yes.
against Islam? You can talk about Christianity all you want, but the very views that have launched planes into buildings that killed 3,000 innocent Americans and continue to kill so many people throughout Western Europe and around the world, you can't say that because then you're a bigot.
If you're an atheist in Iran or Yemen or Saudi Arabia, then your fear is not a phobia. It's not irrational. It's quite real, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We got Matthew Hebb, our new vice president of Atheists for Liberty, saying, he's got a good question here. How hard is it to perform as a comedian in general in Sweden? Like in-person venues, not so much like on state-controlled television.
Well, I'm no longer on state-controlled television, and I don't think I ever will be again. But in-person venues, well, to paraphrase Jimmy Carr about doing comedy in Germany, it's missionary work, basically. When Ansgar, the first Christian missionary to come to Sweden to christen the Vikings in the 700s or 800s, well, I think he was put to death. So if that gives you a general idea. Also, Swedes aren't big laughers. And yeah.
Is that why you came over here? Is that why you were over here for Freedom Fest?
Oh, that was wonderful. I will live on that performance for a year at least. Because, yeah, you were a wonderful audience.
Well, we got to hang out more often. So if you ever come stateside, let the Atheists for Liberty team know, because we go to all these different conventions around the country all the time. So it'd be great. It would be great to catch up with you in person. And I didn't even catch up with you much in person. It was other people on the team that communicated with you. So I would love to I don't know if you drink. I would love to join you over a drink so we can be all grateful that we're not getting hacked by a bunch of theocrats.
I do drink.
You probably have to over there, given what's happening. And actually, speaking of what you were just saying, responding to Matthew's first question, he says, are some forms of speech criminalized in Sweden?
Yes, we have hate speech laws, which now encompass even religion. So it's very, we have freedom of religion. We have it doesn't really make sense, but there are voices calling for prosecuting critics of Islam, for instance, or provocateurs for that matter, under our hate speech laws. So yeah, we have definite restrictions on speech.
Gotcha. We got a comment from Dissident Zero saying the right doesn't seem to criticize Islam as much as they used to. I'll go ahead and plug our episode with Sam Westrup. There was a few episodes ago already on our streaming series. So Dissident Zero, go ahead and check out that episode, and everybody go check out that episode once we're all done here. We actually talk about with Sam how there is a growing far Christian right that's actually emerging, oddly enough, among Gen Z, mainly in the US, but also in other parts of the world, that is very much in alignment with Islamists. And it's very scary to watch. But yeah, a lot of people think that it's just woke left people that are, defending Islam under the guise of Islamophobia. There are people on the right that are doing that too. And I think we need to oppose any kind of dogma, any kind of theocracy, no matter if it comes from the left or the right. But that's why I want them to
go there. I think there are always strange bedfellows, but they have a common interest. And I think freedom of speech and freedom of religion too. That's freedom of religion comes from people defending atheism. Freedom of religion is the right to be wrong. Everyone should have that right.
Yes.
Freedom of speech is the centerpiece of Western civilization. Without it, there is no Western civilization.
There is no Western civilization. We'd all be speaking a very different language right now, I bet.
Yes.
Probably not Swedish nor English.
Wu Fang Shi?
Maybe.
That means I give up in Mandarin.
That could be the future. You could be predicting that. I hope you're wrong, but I don't know. So we got Jesse asking a question. Do you think Sweden has benefited more from remaining uninvolved in political affairs for so long? If so, do you think that the United States would benefit from that as well?
If you're talking in economic terms, absolutely. Sweden has benefited hugely. but this has a detrimental effect on the culture and on individual people's, I wouldn't say soul, but consciousness or conscience, at least. Because, I mean, there's always a certain amount of realpolitik you have to apply if you are to exist and survive in the real world.
Right.
But you should always be aware of who your friends and your enemies are. And you can be your own enemy. And if you don't stand up for your principles, then what exactly? If you're perfectly content with being a morally corrupt individual, but have a materially satisfying life, then go ahead. Otherwise, I suggest you try to stand up for something other than money.
Absolutely. I like money more than everything else, but simultaneously, if you only live once, you want to make, the best of it. And the one thing I've argued that's more valuable than money is time.
So, well, you want to be able to sleep at night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of helpful. We got Lizzie Smith asking, do you think there's a chance for Sweden, and for that matter, America, to reverse course away from woke culture and socialism?
I think yes and yes. You have a much better chance than we do, and I think it's happening for you guys, or at least you have established some sort of border, which is hard to cross now, but for the enemy. But Swedes, I think consensus culture is part of Sweden, and even if we went from socialism, it would be some other type of groupthink. And you have to remember that our Swedish Democrats, which are not social democrats, they are actually, or at least they claim to be, each other's nemesis. Anyway, they are basically, if you look at their ideology, they just want to be the social democrats in the 50s when we didn't have immigration or immigrants here in Sweden. So conservative can mean different things in different countries, and here in Sweden, conservatives try to conserve, well, basically social democracy.
Like classical liberalism, you would say?
What?
Classical liberalism too, you think? Or
in Sweden?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No. Absolutely not. No, Swedes have a very, very bad understanding of concepts such as liberty or freedom. And European politics, especially after the Second World War, were way more concentrated on security than freedom.
I know Germany, they're anti-free speech laws when it comes to any mentions of the Third Reich or anything of that regime, the regime for that matter. I know that was like instituted right away.
Precisely, but I mean that goes for most European nations to a larger or lesser degree, and that security was provided by America via NATO for most part of the last century and all of this so far.
We got one more question left, and then guys, we're gonna just end the show. I'll make a few last-minute announcements. So we got Mars asking the final question of the show for today, episode 30, by the way, everybody. Thank you all so much for continuing to support AFL, becoming members and supporters. So we got Mars saying that opinions are varied now as to whether or not criticism of Islam has become more permissible. Somewhat undecided myself. May we have your thoughts?
I would say no, as long as that part of the world controls most of the oil production. Western countries will be very careful to piss them off, as has been the case since 1973, when oil was applied as a weapon against the West with the embargo. So I would say no, unless you start fracking like crazy people. Then no.
You should come to America then.
Well, start fracking.
We have.
Okay.
So guys, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Oh, we have one bit of good news. Lizzie Smith just ordered a few copies of This Is a Swedish Tiger off of our site. Looking forward to the read. Well,
thank you. And now remember, if you did it from my webpage, it might take quite a while because I'm restructuring it. And if I forget, please DM me on Twitter or in any of the other social media until I respond.
Awesome. Well, guys, you heard it there. And everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. We're continuing this streaming series, and we're trying to be as strict as possible to keep this going every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at 5 p.m. Pacific. We really appreciate all of you continuing to support us by signing up for Atheists for Liberty memberships, donating, contributing as activists. We're always looking for more people to get involved on our various different volunteer committees. We exhibit at conferences throughout the country. So just the constant messages and the constant feedback that we get is amazing. And guys, if you have any other continuous thoughts, if you're watching this in the future when this is not a live stream, leave a comment below on some of your thoughts. We always like to go ahead and like and heart good stuff and comment on everything. And so guys, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/atheistliberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the video, and hit the notification bell for anybody just coming on in. It takes 1 second to hit the like button, and it helps the algorithm so much for us. We're monetized. So help us help you, because the more we grow, the more we get to continue our mission for free speech, free thinking, and freedom for all. Follow us on Twitter, or now X, at Atheist Liberty. We got a good following there. And follow us on Instagram, and we're on so many other amazing platforms. Guys, Atheists for Liberty fights every single day to make sure that we retain our integrity. In comparison to so many other movements and think tanks that have gone rogue, we're a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization. Your membership at only $12 a year, that is a starting membership that we marketed as $1 a month, but it's $12 for the whole year. It allows us to exhibit at conferences around the country, to normalize atheism, preserve free thinking, safeguard secularism, and advance individual liberty. And we're going to continue to do more of that in this new age of reason. So Aron Flam, thank you so much for coming on the show. And everybody, we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.